Hello, everyone. My name is Maureen Folk, and I'm the Outreach and Program Coordinator at the Chapman Museum in Glens Falls, New York. This talk, Next Stop Freedom, the Underground Railroad in the Adirondacks, is on a topic that can be somewhat difficult, but one that we think is really important. So before I dive into how the Underground Railroad operated in this region in particular, I'm going to be discussing a brief history about slavery and the factors that led to the development of the Underground Railroad network. So the first thing I want to do is clarify some of the terms you'll hear me use throughout the talk. You may already know some of these, but others may not, so I'm going to explain them quickly. First, the Underground Railroad was not a physical railroad, and it was not underground, but it was named that because the railroad was a new and exciting technology in the 1820s. Because the railroad was so popular, railroad terminology was commonplace at the time, so words like conductor, line, station, or stop were adopted by those involved in the underground network in order to discuss matters but still maintain secrecy. Individuals who helped enslaved peoples find the railroad were called agents. Guides along the routes were conductors. Harriet Tubman was one of the most famous conductors. Hiding places were called stations. Station masters were those who owned the homes where people were hidden. Individuals escaping slavery were often called passengers, cargo, or freight. By non-railroad operators, individuals escaping slavery were called fugitives, escapees, or runaways, but I will primarily be referring to them as freedom seekers. Last, the term antebellum is going to indicate the time period before the Civil War. Okay, so now that we have some terms covered, I want to talk about slavery in the United States and its origins and the origins of the Underground Railroad. Slavery was the largest forced migration in the world. 12.5 million men, women, and children of African descent were forced into the transatlantic slave trade. The sale of their bodies and the product of their labor brought the Atlantic world into being, including colonial North America. Conditions on this voyage to the New World were so poor that 15% of each ship's enslaved population died before they ever reached land. Slavery in the United States is considered to have begun in 1619 when a ship, the White Lion, brought 20 enslaved Africans ashore in Jamestown, Virginia. The 20 had been seized from a Portuguese ship. Throughout the 17th century, it became more commonplace for European settlers in the colonies to rely on enslaved people for cheaper, plentiful labor. They worked primarily on tobacco, rice, and indigo plantations. This would shift to cotton after the invention of the cotton gin in 1793. After the American Revolution, many colonists began to link the oppression of enslaved Africans to their own oppression by the British. And while we know that these were two very different versions of oppression, it created empathy, which became a foundation for protest. So this is where we start to hear the first calls for slavery to be abolished. And it's primarily happening in the North because the agricultural practice in the North wasn't relying on slavery in order to operate. Agricultural practice in the North was on a much smaller scale comparatively, and slavery was never widespread in the North, though many grew rich off the backs of Southern plantation workers. Between 1744 and 1804, most of the Northern states abolished slavery. New York would be a little bit later. They wouldn't abolish slavery until 1827. The U.S. Congress would outlaw the African slave trade in 1808, but domestic trade continued to flourish, and the enslaved population in the United States tripled over the next 50 years as laws in certain states maintained that those born to enslaved people automatically became property of the parents' owners. By 1860, there were nearly 4 million enslaved people in the United States. Between 1860 and 1861, several Southern states seceded from Northern states and formed the Confederate States of America. There were a few factors that played into this, but it was a direct result of the growing tension regarding beliefs on slavery. From the 1830s to the 1860s, the movement to abolish slavery gained strength. Many took a religious approach and condemned slavery as a sin, while others were more aligned with non-religious reasons and stated slaveholding was regressive, inefficient, or made little economic sense. As early as the 1780s, individuals were helping enslaved people escape from southern plantations and retreat to the north in most cases. This loose network of safe houses would gain momentum in the 1830s and would become known as the Underground Railroad. The earliest documented mention of the Underground Railroad was in 1831 when Tice Davis escaped from Kentucky into Ohio, and his owner said in a newspaper article that the Underground Railroad was to blame. This continues to grow in the 1830s, and by the 1840s, the term Underground Railroad is part of the American vernacular. Many escaped without the aid of this system, but as time wore on, there was an increase in efforts to assist freedom seekers. While we traditionally think of Canada as the promised land, not all freedom seekers went north. Some moved to Mexico, Spanish-occupied Florida, west to Caribbean islands, or to Europe. Wherever there were enslaved people, there were people eager to escape. While we know that the conditions and treatment of enslaved people were incredibly poor, there were many factors that led to their decision to escape, and if they were caught, it was met with harsh consequences. During their escape, they were prey to starvation, capture, swamps infested with alligators or snakes, and trained bloodhounds. Most freedom seekers were coming from border states like Kentucky, Virginia, or Maryland. Those in the Deep South had a much harder time. Some thought they would be safe if they simply made it to a free state, but the Fugitive Slave Act in 1793 allowed local governments to apprehend and extradite escaped enslaved people from the borders of free states back to their point of origin. Slave owners commonly placed ads in newspapers to recapture their slaves, offering lucrative rewards. There was also a fine of $500 imposed on anyone who aided fugitive slaves. Frederick Douglass wrote that all great turnpikes running north were beset with kidnappers, a class of men who watched the newspapers for advertisements of runaway slaves making a living by the accursed reward of slave hunting. In response to this new law in 1793, we see Black citizens who live in some of these free states organized to protect themselves. It's largely from this pressure that we see the Underground Railroad develop. Because slavery was in opposition to their religion, Quakers were among the first to publicly condemn slavery in America, as well as the Philadelphia Abolition Society, which formed in 1775. Benjamin Franklin was a leading member of that organization. Glens Falls was founded by Quakers, and while it is not exclusively populated by them anymore, the anti-slavery sentiment remained very strong in this area. Because of its proximity to Canada, New York was a hopeful path to freedom. Canada was an ideal location because they outlawed slavery in 1834. Counties in northern New York were quite rural, especially after passing Albany or Troy, and this meant that if freedom seekers could get to Albany, they had a few options for how to proceed through New York and up to the Canadian border. The multitude of options was actually ideal. It made it more difficult for slave catchers to find freedom seekers. Routes existed through the Adirondacks, the Green Mountains, the Berkshires, or west through Syracuse, across Lake Ontario, or through Elmira, Owego, and up to Cayuga Lake, which is the route that Harriet Tubman was a conductor on. Underground Railroad routes often followed natural and man-made modes of transportation like rivers, canals, bays, and the Atlantic Ocean coast, following trails, roads, river crossings, or using ferries. Freedom seekers primarily traveled on foot, but they would also use wagons, stagecoaches, trains, or boats. By 1840, New York State abolitionists had effectively organized the framework of the Underground Railroad that would remain in place over the next 20 years until the Civil War. There are very few ways to confirm with absolute certainty that a place was a station on the Underground Railroad. Hideaways have been found behind fireplaces, under trapdoors, in attics or crawl spaces, but the presence of these spaces does not necessarily mean that a station existed in that house. This is where we need to investigate and decipher the difference between history and legend. So now we're going to talk about 3 local counties and some of the possible station locations within them. There are many locations throughout this region that we will not cover. I'm just going to be focusing on Saratoga, Washington, and Warren counties for this specific talk. And again, the list that I present here is not exhaustive. There's other locations that folks have believed to be connected to the Underground Railroad that we won't be covering. First, I'd like to start with Saratoga County. Saratoga County played a much different role in the Underground Railroad than its neighbors. As a popular summer spot for many, it was also popular for slave catchers and wealthy Southern slave owners. According to the U.S. Census, between 1790 and 1820, Saratoga Springs was home to nearly 500 resident slaves. Solomon Northrop was kidnapped by some of these slave catchers in Saratoga Springs in 1841. And while we won't be talking about his story because he did not return on the Underground Railroad, it's important to mention because it shows that even in free states like New York, it was dangerous for free Black individuals. While they would try to avoid more populous parts of the county, there were still a few spots that were rumored to be stations. In Milton, the old Maury residence near Route 29 is believed to have been a station. A former town historian was told that there was a room in the house that sheltered freedom seekers. It was said that Mr. Maury transported freedom seekers after nightfall in a wagon covered with hay. From Maury's, it was only a short distance to Mason Anthony's home in Greenfield. Anthony was known for aiding freedom seekers as early as 1838. According to a memoir of Lydia Frances Sherman in 1849, after freedom seekers left the home of Mason Anthony, Anthony would bring them to the Sherman House in Hadley and then on to the Beach House in Luzerne. In South Glens Falls, the Parks Bentley House has long been rumored as a station. The house has no evidence beyond a trap door that leads to a crawl space beneath the first floor. But this is an example of how an oral legend can live on. Another possible station is known as Mr. Fitch's cabin. Mr. Fitch was a freedom seeker himself. He came to the county seeking his own freedom and settled on a mountaintop overlooking Effnor Lake near Corinth. Remnants of his cabin do still exist, but it's primarily a foundation and stone wall. But imagine the sense of comfort that freedom seekers might have felt to come across an African-American man living peacefully in the woods. This may have been a stop that provided a little bit of hope for these travelers. Again, there's always these multiple routes that they could travel, so this is just one option. Washington County was arguably the most active county in this region because of its proximity to the Champlain Canal and Lake Champlain, as well as the fact that it's just a little bit more rural. Rolling farmland, green foothills, and quaint villages are much the same today as they were in the antebellum period. Abolitionists frequently gave lectures in this region to encourage emancipation, and one of those lecturers was Frederick Douglass. Two of the most active locations were Union Village, which is now known as Greenwich, and Argyle. The president of the New York Anti-Slavery Society, Henry B. Stanton, held an anti-slavery convention in Union Village in 1839. Union Village was kind of the center of the Underground Railroad in this region. It was packed with abolitionists, and many of the homes in what is the modern day Park Street area. Here it's Church Street. Have legends of participation on the railroad. Multiple members of the Free Church resided here, and the Free Church was formed solely on the foundation of anti-slavery beliefs in 1837. A secret tunnel was rumored to run the length of Park Street, so abolitionists and freedom seekers could move between homes unnoticed. The Gibbs House, Mowry House, and Corliss House were all considered to be stations. One of the most significant conductors in Union Village was Dr. Hiram Corliss. Corliss was a prominent surgeon of his time, and he supported many causes, but above all, he was a passionate abolitionist. Heading north from Union Village, you arrive in Argyle. Argyle is where Washington County's Anti-Slavery Society formed in 1834. On the night of November 18th, 1834, abolitionists arrived at the Dutch Reformed Church in Argyle and found the doors locked and the windows nailed shut. They ended up breaking through one of those windows and holding their meeting. They nominated officers, drafted resolutions, and then recessed for dinner at a local public house. When they returned from dinner, they found a mob of 20 individuals had barred the doors and fastened down the windows. Being men of peace, they didn't engage and instead just returned to the public house and resumed their meeting. After this incident, they met at the Presbyterian Church, which was suspended from its associate synod in 1839 for opposing the church's formal position on slavery. The reverend of the church at the time, James P. Miller, was a passionate abolitionist, and this was actually a very common problem. Churches were resisting the call for immediate emancipation, not because they believed slavery to be moral, but because they weren't ready to abolish it. Denominations in the North and the South were and are connected. Many denominations in the South were receiving donations from wealthy slave owners and could not afford to lose that financial support. As more and more people in the North took a strong stance against slavery, they were turned away by the church. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence for Argyle's role in the Underground Railroad is a story that involves two children. Austin and Horace Phillips were Black twin boys born in an Argyle poorhouse in the 1830s. It's believed that their parents were freedom seekers, and the children were born while the parents were on their way to freedom. Because of these circumstances, the children were left behind, but they were taken in by local families and cared for. Austin remained in the area and served in the Civil War. He lived locally until he died at the age of 85. In the 1950s, excavations on Main Street revealed a 500-foot underground passageway near the former home of Ransom Stiles. Stiles was the town supervisor and president during the abolition period. There were other homes within Argyle that make claims, but it's most likely that Argyle was more of a pass-through along a high-trafficked route rather than a stopping point. Leaving Argyle, freedom seekers could head towards Granville or Sandy Hill, which is now called Hudson Falls. Sandy Hill has several possible stations. Dunham's Basin and the Van Vranken family home are two, as well as a brick home built in 1823 on Pearl Street and the former Mead House on Moss Street in Kingsbury. Dunham's Basin is close in proximity to the feeder canal, and that would have been ideal because the feeder canal connected to the Champlain Canal and then up to Lake Champlain and on to Canada. In addition to a few possible stations in houses, there are two artifacts that have been speculated to be in connection with the Underground Railroad that exist in Washington County, and they've been a source of conjecture and fascination. So the first is a stone chair. On the chair, the date May 23rd, 1841 is inscribed, along with a series of small illustrations. Some believe these illustrations are a map that would show freedom seekers where to catch a boat to Canada. The chair originally had legs, but they would be destroyed by a road crew in the 1930s. There's some speculation about who carved the chair, but the truth has never been uncovered. The second artifact is a sign. The sign shows a Black man dressed in his Sunday best with a top hat and a cane, and he's pointing north. And the sign reads 4.5 miles to Fort Anne. It's believed that the original version of this sign was painted by Collins Doubleday in 1853 and simply had a black hand pointing north. It was rumored that this sign was a landmark for those traveling on the Underground Railroad. If you followed the path it pointed towards, in 4.5 miles, you would reach the Goodman Farm in Fort Anne. The farm was a short distance from the stone library that was built in 1825, and that stone library was thought to be a station. It was also 1/2 mile from the Champlain Canal, and access to that canal meant that they would be able to travel up to Lake Champlain and get on a ferry to Canada. Unfortunately, this sign has been vandalized multiple times, and so the homeowners who own the property where the sign is have taken the sign inside so that it can no longer be vandalized. Heading into more northern parts of Washington County, like Whitehall, we do start to see fewer stations. Whitehall acted as a gateway to Canada, so there wouldn't have been much incentive for folks to stay in town when they could get on a ferry and travel north. Some did choose to settle in this region, though, and there was a small population of Black barbers who lived in Whitehall during the abolition period. Free Blacks who wanted to start businesses were limited in terms of what would bring them success because of existing racial prejudice. So barbershops were an ideal business, and they were often the most successful at this time. Felix Schuyler and Thomas Joseph were two such barbers who settled in Whitehall. Shifting over to Warren County, much like Washington County, it was more sparsely populated and had a lot of backwoods. This was ideal for not being caught or captured. The first documented account of an anti-slavery society meeting in Warren County was on October 30th, 1845 in Queensbury, when the Queensbury Liberty Party Association was formed. Though this is the first meeting on official record, it's very likely that this was not the first meeting of its kind. As early as 1840, the New York State Anti-Slavery Society lists A.G. Hawley of Warren County as the vice president. Glens Falls had several known stops that I'll mention. The Boyd Place on Park Street, Dr. Joseph Stoddard's home on Exchange Street, and Dr. Hiram McNutt's house here on Bacon Street. The Boyd Place and Dr. Stoddard's homes were identified as possible stations in a Boyd family member's memoir. Samuel Boyd recounted a story that I'll now share with you. A gentleman named John Van Pelt, a free Black man, and his wife, Lucretia, a woman who escaped slavery, made the decision to settle in Glens Falls following her escape from slavery in 1846. The couple married 1 year later. One morning, two boys, Ad Stoddard and Samuel Boyd, were skating on the sidewalk when a man approached them. The man asked if the boys knew where Mr. Van Pelt lived. Samuel Boyd was 8 years old and enthusiastically answered, yes, he did. Stoddard, at only 9 years old, was just a little bit more perceptive and said that Boyd didn't really know, but he knew and he would give him the directions. Stoddard purposefully gave the wrong directions, leading the man away from where the Van Pelts lived. Stoddard did this because he had heard that some people may come looking for Lucretia. Stoddard went and told his father, and within an hour, the Van Pelt family was on their way to safety. Van Pelt accompanied his family to Prescott, Canada, and then returned to Glens Falls. He tried to negotiate with the men for his wife's freedom and was unable to pay the $600 that they demanded. Van Pelt was forced to sell his barbershop and permanently move to Canada as a result. This is just one example of a time when the recapture of former slaves was attempted far into the North. But this is also an example of the strength of the anti-slavery sentiments that were held in Glens Falls. When he was many years older, Samuel Boyd was quoted saying, "The village became a station on the so-called Underground Railroad, which aided any fugitive slave to reach the Canadian border and freedom. Many of our prominent citizens knew all the ropes and helped pull them." Hiram McNutt was the president of the Warren County Medical Society and was long rumored to be a conductor on the Underground Railroad. Dr. McNutt owned 2 properties in Warren County, one on 12 Bacon Street and another in Warrensburg, and both had long been rumored to be stations on the Underground Railroad. A former owner of the Bacon Street home claimed to have found a hidden room accessible through a crawl space. While this is the only anecdote about the house itself, it does seem like a more credible claim based on the actions of Dr. McNutt and his involvement with many anti-slavery organizations. This image here does show that 12 Bacon Street is not only right by the Chapman Museum, but this is the house. This is obviously not the original house that would have been there in the early to mid 1800s. So the house has since been torn down and a new one has been built, but it's just an interesting anecdote to have it so close to the museum. Further north into Warren County, Chestertown was considered the most abolitionized community in the county. The leading abolitionist there was Quaker Joseph W. Leggett. Leggett was the first person in the county on record showing a commitment to abolitionism when he was listed as an agent for the New York City-based abolition newspaper, The Emancipator, in 1836. The Leggett House was located a couple miles south of the village of Chestertown along Route 9. Joseph Leggett's son, Benjamin Franklin Leggett, wrote about seeing freedom seekers in their home as a child. When examining papers from the home, a receipt for services from Dr. Hiram McNutt in Glens Falls connected these 2 men. Perhaps it was a coincidence, or perhaps it wasn't one at all, but this paper served as a connection between 2 suspected conductors of the Underground Railroad, which is a great piece of evidence. The last possible station in Warren County that I'm going to mention is the Tyrell House. The home of Judge Tyrell was never suspected of being a stop on the Underground Railroad until an excavation was needed during a project to remodel the front porch. The homeowners at the time of the remodel, the walk-ups, discovered an entrance to a small room that was accessible only from a crawl space outside. Inside the entrance, they found tin lanterns and a floor that opened to a separate cellar and a hidden room. In the room was a cot, dresser, washstand, water pitcher, candle, folded sheet, blanket, and a Bible. To my knowledge, there are no photos of this discovery, of this space, but if the story is true, it would certainly help make a case for the Tyrell House as a stop on the Underground Railroad. The presence of multiple stations in the area was great for freedom seekers on the move north, but what was even more critical was the presence of abolitionists. Most railroad conductors were ordinary people, farmers, business owners, as well as many ministers. It was at their own personal risk to speak out against slavery. The beginning of the abolitionist movement is often credited to William Lloyd Garrison's publication of an anti-slavery newspaper on January 1st, 1831. One Adirondack abolitionist that I want to mention is Gerrit Smith. Smith was a passionate abolitionist who set aside 120,000 acres of his own land in the Adirondacks and other sections of the Northeast and Central New York to be parceled into 40-acre homesteads for Black men between the ages of 21 and 60. And this not only gave them a new beginning, but it qualified them to vote based on New York State's property qualification at the time. The parcels of the land in the Adirondacks that were centrally located in North Elba became a community as it developed, and they named it Timbuktu. Smith traveled around the Adirondacks on a speaking tour. When visiting Saratoga, he noted, "The village is thought to be as unfavorable a soil as Charleston or New Orleans for anti-slavery." This was because the area was popular for Southerners and slave catchers. He spoke at the Presbyterian Church in Glens Falls in 1845 and stated, "I have never been in a village which promises better for the anti-slavery cause." Two such drastic statements about locations with only 18 miles between them. This was the case for many Adirondack towns. He would find one with strong abolitionists and others with none. This was pretty common on his tour. The call for emancipation was growing. In 1837, there were 274 anti-slavery societies in New York State. A convention held in Albany a year later, in 1838, linked abolitionists from across the state as more than 200 individuals attended. By the end of that year, more than 1,300 anti-slavery societies had formed in the North, and that number continued to grow. Nearly 24 years after these organizations were forming, on September 22nd, 1862, Lincoln issued a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. He made it official on January 1st, 1863. He freed some 3 million people in the rebel states. Now, this did not put an end to all slavery in the United States. The 13th Amendment at the end of the Civil War in 1865 would put it to a formal end. And while freedom was preferable to slavery, it was hardly the end of problems caused by racial prejudice. Once they became free, their freedom was limited by law and custom, and the struggle for civil rights was just beginning. It's estimated that between 40,000 and 100,000 freedom seekers were aided over the course of the underground operation. At its peak, 14 northern states and Canada were part of this network. Many considered Canada their final destination, and it's estimated that 30 to 40,000 freedom seekers settled in Canada, more than half of which arrived between 1850 and 1860. Canada was offering Black citizens the freedom to live, sit on juries, or run for public office. Canada was a desirable option for multiple reasons. Free Blacks could not be certain of their place in American society because prejudice was liable to appear out of nowhere and in places that they least expected. People may have been anti-slavery, yes, but that did not mean that they wanted full equality. Many were anti-slavery, but pro-segregation. It's important to note that Black citizens in Canada also experienced extreme racial prejudice and segregation. That was not exclusive to the United States. And while we know many settled in Canada, it's impossible to know the true number, as many feared being included in any sort of census records. Ultimately, there were no published maps, guides, or pamphlets to lead freedom seekers to their destinations. They had to rely on the secret help of thousands of people. Our understanding of the Underground Railroad is largely based on oral histories, and there are a lot of compelling stories, but this is also the power of legends, so we can't be sure what pieces are actually truth. One of the most difficult barriers to tracking stations is simply time. Streets, neighborhoods, and cities have changed and developed, and some of the significant places were lost before we ever had the chance to know how important they were. But the beauty of the Underground Railroad is in this secrecy. I cannot think of a better testament to the railroad and its conductor's success than the matter that we still know so little about it. It was developed in secrecy, and it will keep many more secrets in perpetuity.